Hey, what's up? My name's Dustin, and I'm a developer here at Treehouse. Today, I want to take you through setting up a Google Chrome extension. It's actually a lot simpler than it seems. We'll be creating a strong password generator. This extension will allow us to generate a random strong password customized to our liking. We'll be able to choose if we want numbers, special characters, or a mix of uppercase and lowercase letters. We'll even be able to choose how long we want the password to be, and then we can copy our password to our clipboard when we're done. Before we get started, I do want to mention that this project is for learning purposes only. Yes, we'll be using HTML, CSS, and JavaScript to build out our Google Chrome extension, and this is a great project to practice those skills. But it is absolutely not recommended for you to use something like this to work with your passwords. Instead, you should use software that's specifically designed to securely manage and store your passwords. I'll link below some helpful resources to some good password managers and articles on why you should use them. But if you're familiar with the topics that I've discussed and you want to get started, we'll be building this project from scratch. So open up your favorite text editor and let's get started. This is a longer video, so if you'd like to skip to a specific part, check out the description or teacher's notes down below. So let's get started building out our Google Chrome extension. There's no GitHub repo associated with this project, so all you need to get started is to either create a new repo for your project or just create a project folder on your machine and open it up in your favorite text editor. I'm going to use VS Code, but feel free to use whichever you prefer. The only thing my project folder has are some icons in an assets folder, as well as a mockup of the project that we'll be building. I have named the icons icon 16, icon 48, and icon 128 respectively, and their name corresponds to their dimensions, and these icons are what are used in Chrome to show your extension. I won't go into how I made these, but you can download some icons from the internet or just create your own. I like to use a free application called Figma to create fun little icons like these. I'll leave a link down below in the description or teacher's notes for more information about Figma. But you don't need any icons to get your extension to work, so you can still follow along if you don't have them ready yet. Let's get started setting up some files that we'll need. I'll first create a popup.html file. And this may seem super weird that we're naming it popup.html, but it'll make sense when we start converting this to a Chrome extension later on. In my popup.html file, I'll create some boilerplate by writing an exclamation mark and tab. And this is an image shortcut. I'll link more info on that down below. Let's give our project a name. I'll update the title to say strong password. Next, we can link up our style sheet. This doesn't exist yet, but we'll create that up in a bit. I'll write the path for an app.css style sheet inside of our styles folder. Next, I'll link up our scripts file, which also doesn't exist yet, but we'll create that soon. I'll write the path for an app.js file inside of a scripts folder. Now that all those files are linked up, let's actually create them. I'll create a folder for our styles and I'll name it styles, and I'll set up a folder for our scripts named scripts. Next, I'll just create an app.js file inside of the scripts folder, and then I'll create an app.scss file inside of our styles folder. Since we'll be writing a lot of CSS, I'm choosing to write this with SCSS. I won't be doing anything super complex with it, but I'll just be using it for nesting some CSS rules. If you want to follow along with me, there's really no learning curve to how I'll be using it if you've never used it before. To get started using SCSS though, you'll just need to install one extension. Head on over to your text editor's extensions menu and just type in SASS. In VS Code, you'll see this Live SASS compiler extension by Glenn Marks. You'll want to install that. And once it's installed, you should notice this Watch SASS button at the bottom of the text editor. Whenever you're ready to start styling our project, you'll just want to click on the Watch SASS button, and it'll automatically create a CSS file with all of our compiled SCSS inside. And this is the file that our HTML file is linked with. With that all out of the way, let's start writing some code. I'll close out all the files except for our popup.html file, and I'll also open up our mockup. I'll push the mockup to the right of the text editor so that I can see it side by side with our HTML file. The first thing that we can do is set up a container for our UI. I'll create a div with the class of container. And taking a look at our mockup, the first thing that we can put into this container div is a container for our lock logo in the upper left corner. I'll create a div with the class of lock logo div, and inside of that, I'll just throw in our image of our icon. This lock icon will be positioned absolutely later in the CSS. The next thing that we can tackle is creating sections for each of our main blocks of the UI. I'll first create a section for our settings. I'll create a section element with the class of settings container. And in this section, we'll house all of those toggle switches. For each setting, let's create a div with the class of setting, and each one of these settings will have a label and a checkbox input. We'll style these checkbox inputs to look like toggle switches later in the CSS. Let's create a label, and we'll leave the for attribute empty for now. And inside of this label, I'll create two spans, one for the settings title and one for the optional settings description. Now we can hop outside of our label element, and I'll create our input with the type of checkbox. I'll give it the checked attribute since in the mockup it looks like the first checkbox is initially checked. Then I'll give this one an ID of include digits. I'll copy over this ID and paste it into our label's for attribute. This is so that we can map the label with the correct input, and clicking the label will also toggle the checkbox, which is great UX. Next, we'll just repeat this process of creating an individual setting for each of the settings in our mockup. And I'll make sure that each input has the same ID as its label's for attribute, and I'll update the title and descriptions. I'll also make sure to add a checked state for each of the settings that need to be checked by default. Once that's done, I'll close each setting block in my HTML as well as the section block for our settings container. Next, let's set up a new section. I'll create a section element with the class of character length. In here, we can just put a paragraph tag with the text, your password will be, and then we can put in a span element with the ID of char length span. And we'll just write 15 as the span's text, and we'll finish the paragraph tag with characters long. Next, we'll add another paragraph tag with the text, move the slider to adjust the length of your password. Now we'll create that slider. It's actually pretty simple. It's only an input with the type of range, and we'll give it a few attributes. For the ID, I'll write character length slider, and I'll set its min to 10, its max to 75, and its value to 15. And that will be it for our character length section. So let's close down that code block, and now we can create our last section, which is going to be for the randomly generated password. We can start that off by creating another section element, and we'll give it the class of generated password. Taking a look at the mockup, it looks like we'll need an input and a button. So I'll start by creating an input with the type of text, and I'll give it an ID of generated password. I'll also add spell check equals false, and this is just so that we don't have a red line under our generated password. And finally, we'll create a button element with the class of copy password as well as an ID of copy password. For the button's text, we'll just write copy. I want to show the user that their password has been copied to their clipboard, so I'll create a div element that will position absolutely inside of this section element. That will be the full height and width of this generated password section. And in the center of this div, it'll display copy once the button's been clicked. So let's go ahead and add that now. I'll just create a div with the class of confirmation as well as an ID of confirmation. And inside, I'll just create a paragraph tag with the text password copied. Sweet, that's all for our generated password section as well as all the markup that we'll need for our Chrome extension. So let's start styling this up. Let's open our SCSS file and make sure you click the Watch SASS button at the bottom of your editor if you're using VS Code. It should say watching. I'll first paste in an import for a Google font, and I'm using Gotham Rounded, but feel free to use whichever Google font that you'd like. I'll also paste in some SCSS variables that I've created beforehand to help us style out our UI. You can copy these from the description or teacher's notes down below. If you're new to SCSS, let me show you how variables work. You define them by writing a $sign and then the name of the variable. And to use them, you just write the same name as a value to a property. Let me give you an example. On line 3, we see an SCSS variable named primary. I'll use this as the value for a color property inside of a CSS rule. It's pretty straightforward. Let's remove this example and start styling our extension. Since this guide is mostly focused on the JavaScript as well as converting this into a Chrome extension, I'll speed up the styles portion of this tutorial a bit. Feel free to slow me down if you need to. We can get started by writing some styles to reset our browser's default styles. I'll update the margin and padding to 0 and set the box sizing to border box. Next, let's set up a body rule and give it some styles. I'll update the font family to Gotham Rounded with a sans serif fallback. We'll update the font size and font weight, and we'll use our primary variable to set our background color. We'll also update the text color with a variable, and then we'll add some padding. Now that we have a few initial styles, let's open up popup.html in the browser and check it out. Don't worry, this won't always live in the browser. We'll transform this into a Chrome extension when we're done. Great, looks like our styles are applying. So let's hop back into the SCSS and set up a rule for our container class. We'll just add a width of 400 pixels, a white background color, one rim of border radius, and I'll also add some padding. Next, we'll add a position of relative so that we can absolutely position our logo. Now, let's target that logo container by writing a rule for our lock logo div class. To style out the logo just right, we'll position it absolute and then set the top property equal to our logo size variable divided by -2. Then we'll set the left to 1 rim, and we'll use our logo size variable for the height and width and set the background color to white. We can give a border of 6 pixels solid with our primary variable for the color, and then we'll center the logo inside of the div by writing a display of flex, and we'll justify the content center and align the item center. And then last, we can give our border radius of 50% to make it a perfect circle. We'll then nest the logo image and give it a width of 0.9 rim. Now we're going to style our first section. I'll write a new rule for section with the class of settings container. Inside this rule, I'll nest our setting class and start by giving it a display of flex. We'll align the item center and then we'll add some margin. Then we'll nest the label for this setting class and give it a width of 80% and some right padding. We'll then nest the span inside of the label and give it a display of block. Now I want to target the first span and give it a font weight of 500 and a font size of 0.9 rim. And for the last span element, which is our optional setting description, we'll lower the font weight to 300, we'll add a darker text color and update the font size to 0.7 rim, and then we'll just adjust the top margin to 0.15 rim. I'll now close down our label rule code block, and I'll now nest an input with the type of checkbox inside our setting rule. To get these checkboxes to look like toggle switches, I'll set the appearance to none, and I'll position them relative. I'll set the width to 50 pixels, and then we'll just add a light gray background color variable. I'll adjust the height to 30 pixels and set a border radius to 25 pixels. And then we'll just give them a cursor of pointer. So that these switches can have a nice animation, we'll also add a transition property of background color 0.3 seconds ease. Now we'll add an after pseudo element to the checkbox and give it an empty string for content, and then I'll position it absolute. To center the switch inside of the checkbox, I'll write transform, translate, and we'll translate -50% on the X and Y axis, and we'll give them 21 pixels in height and width. I'll write a white background color with 50% border radius, and we'll position the top 50% and the left 30%. We'll also give some transition values. We'll close down the after pseudo element rule and write a checked pseudo class rule. We'll just want to update the background color when the input is checked, and then we'll nest our after pseudo element inside this hover rule and change the left property to 70%. Awesome, now when we click our checkboxes, they work like toggle switches. Check out the description or teacher's notes down below for content specifically covering how to do this in more depth. I'll completely close down our first section rule and create a new one for our character length section. We can start by adding some margin and aligning the text to the center. Now I'm going to target the first paragraph tag and up the font weight to 500 and lower the font size. I'll then nest the span inside of the first paragraph rule, and I'll just give it the primary variable for the color, and I'll also up the font size to 1 rim. Now, outside of the first paragraph rule, I'll target the last paragraph, and we'll update the margin. I'll set the font size to 0.6 rim, and we'll adjust the color using the text light variable. Alright, now let's style our range input. I'll create a rule for an input with the type of range, and just like the toggle switches, we'll set the appearance to none. I'll add a cursor of pointer and give it a width of 100%. I'll remove the outline and give it 2 rem of border radius. Now I'll create a rule for our input targeting the slider's runnable track, and I'll just set the background color to our light gray variable and give it 0.15 rem in height. Then I'll target the input's slider thumb, and this is the draggable part of our range input. It'll also get an appearance of none. I'll set a -7 rem in margin top, and I'll give a background color using our primary variable. The height and width will be set at 1 rem, and I'll give it 50% border radius. Let's also add some styles for when we focus on the slider thumb. We'll add a thin light gray border, and we'll also add a 3-pixel light gray outline. We'll also want to adjust the outline offset by 0.125 rem. And now we see some focus styles when we drag our range input. Cool, I think that's it for our character length section. Let's start styling the last section of our extension. I'll set up a rule for our generated password section. Since we'll want to add a confirmation to this section, I'll give it a position of relative so that we can style the confirmation absolutely. I'll also give the section a display of flex and align the item's center. And now I'll write a rule for both the input and the button to give them both the same stylings. I'll give them a font family of Gotham Rounded, a font weight of 500, and then I'll just give it a height of 3 rem. Now let's target just the input. We'll give it a width of 100% and add some border radius. And I'll also add a light gray border. We can write border 1 pixel solid and use our light gray variable for the color. Let's also remove the right border. Then we'll also want to use our lighter gray variable for the background color, and I'll add some padding and make sure the font size is set to 1 rem. I'll also give our text darker variable for the text color and set the outline to none. That's it for the input, so now let's target the button. We'll set a height of 3 rem and a width of 4 rem. Let's display flex and align the item center, and we'll also justify the content center as well. We'll set up a light gray border, then let's add some border radius. And make sure the background color is transparent. We can give it a cursor of pointer and then add our text darker variable for the text color. Lastly, we'll give it a background transition. Hitting save will see our input and button looking like the mockup, but we should work on the button's hover state as well as the confirmation message. What we can do is set up a hover rule for our button, and we'll just want to update the background color on hover by writing background color and using our lighter gray variable. Now let's work on the confirmation message. Let's set up a rule for our confirmation class and give it a position of absolute. We'll set the top and left to 50%, and we'll translate the X and Y axis at -50% as well. We'll set the height and width to 100% and give it a white background color. Now let's center the text by writing display flex and justifying the content center and aligning the items center as well. We'll make the font weight darker and set the pointer events to none. If you're unfamiliar with pointer events, setting it to none essentially removes all pointer events such as clicking, hovering, dragging, etc. We'll set the opacity to 0 and we'll transition everything 0.1 seconds ease. When we want the confirmation message to show, we'll want to reset the pointer events and opacity. So let's write a rule for when our confirmation div also has a class of active. In this rule, we can set the pointer events to all and bring the opacity back up to 1. We can test that this works by opening up the developer console and adding the class of active to our confirmation div. And now we can see that our confirmation pops in just how we want it to. Let's also animate our paragraph tag that holds the password copied text. Above our active class rule, let's target the paragraph tag and give it some styles. We can set its initial scale to 0.2 and give it a transition for its transform property. Now let's target the paragraph when our confirmation has a class of active. All we'll do is just bump the scale up to 1.1. And that'll be all the styles that we need. Our UI is complete and it's time to work on the logic for our extension, so let's write some JavaScript. I want to store the data that we'll need to generate our passwords in individual arrays. So let's set up some variables to hold this data. We can set up an array for digits, an array for special characters, and we'll also want to set up an array for letters. I'll create one array for lowercase letters and one array for uppercase letters. Now that we've created the arrays, let's populate them. In the digits array, I'll just write 0 through 9, And in the specials array, I'll throw in a few special characters, but feel free to add in as many special characters as you'd like. For the array for lowercase letters, you can type out each letter if you want, or find an array online that's already written out. I went ahead and found this bit of JavaScript that returns the full alphabet in lowercase letters. I'll just paste this inside the array. If you'd like to use this too, I'll paste a snippet in the description or teacher's notes down below. We can see that this works by logging this variable to the console. I'll console.log letters lowercase, and you see that we are returned with an array with all lowercase letters. Because we now have an array with all lowercase letters, what we can do is map through that array and run the toUpperCase method on each letter, and we'll get back an array of uppercase letters. So let's do that now inside of the letters uppercase array. We can start by writing letters lowercase dot map, and for each letter, we want to return letter dot toUpperCase. Now let's log letters uppercase to the console and see if it worked. I'll console.log letters uppercase, and looks like we get back an array of uppercase letters. Perfect. Okay, so let's remove the console.log and let's start structuring out our logic. Let's set up some variables that we'll need. We can first set up a variable called password length, and we'll let it equal document.querySelector, and we'll target the input with the type of range. Now let's set up a variable for all of our checkbox inputs, and we can do this pretty easily by writing const all checkboxes equal document.querySelector all, and targeting the input with the type of checkbox. We'll want to have a main function for generating the password, so let's set that up, and for now it'll just log out password generated. Now I want to make sure that our variables are working by running event listeners. So for the range input, we'll write password length dot add event listener, and because this is an input, we have access to the change event. When we detect a change, let's call our generate password function. So if we hop into our browser, we should see the console update each time we move the slider. And perfect, it works. Now let's do the same thing for our checkboxes. Instead of writing an event listener for each one, we can loop over each checkbox and add the event listener. So let's do that now by writing our all checkboxes variable, which holds a collection of HTML elements, and we'll run the for each method on it. For each checkbox, we'll add an event listener for change. Since this is an input, we have access to the change event. And when a change is detected, we'll just call our generate password function. Now let's test to see if this worked. Each checkbox should fire the generate password function when its input changes its checked state. Sweet, it works perfectly. Now let's remove our generate password function from our password length event listener temporarily. And we'll want to give the event listener access to the event. This is so that we know what the value of the range input is each time the event is triggered. Let's set up a variable for the value and have it equal to the event.target.value. We can console.log this value in the browser, and we'll see the value each time the event is triggered. This is perfect because we'll want to know what the length of our password should be based off the range's value. Since we now know the value of our range input when it changes, we can pass that in as an argument in our generate password function. We'll just call this argument length. And now in our password length event listener, let's call our generate password function again and give it the value as the parameter. We'll want to know this value even when we aren't changing the length of our password. For example, if we're clicking one of the toggle switches, it'll generate a new password, so we'll still want to know the length. So what we can do is in our event listener for our checkboxes, we can call the generate password function with password length.value as the length parameter. Now, inside of our generate password function, instead of console logging password generated, let's log the length argument. I'll hit save, and now when we adjust our range input, we see its value logged to the console each time. And if we check or uncheck a toggle switch, the current value of our range input is logged to the console. Perfect. Now that we know what the password length is, we'll also want to initially just call our function when the extension loads. So we'll just make a call to generate password with the password length value as the parameter. Now in our generate password function, let's start by updating the char length span in the UI with the length of our range input. We can do that by writing document.getElementById char length span and setting the text content to either the length parameter or password length.value. Now, when we move our slider, the UI changes to show the length of our password. I'll set up a comment so that we know what this bit of logic is doing, and I'll also set up a comment for the next part we'll work on, which is working with the checked states of our inputs. Let's first set up a variable for each one of our inputs. I'll write const include digits and set that equal to document.getElementById include digits. Then I'll write const special char, and I'll set that one equal to document.getElementById special char. And lastly, we can set up const letter mix equals document.getElementById letter mix. You can see that if we console.log each of these variables .checked, it returns either true or false based off if the checkbox is checked or not. This will come in handy because we'll want to adjust the generated password if the setting is turned off or not. So what we should do is write .checked on the end of these variables so that they hold either a true or false value. Now let's set up an array that can hold all the values that our password could possibly contain based off of which settings are toggled on. For example, if include digits is set to true, we'll want to add our digits array to this array, and so on and so on. I'll set up a variable named possible password chars and set it initially equal to an empty array. Now I'll run a conditional for each of our checkboxes. I'll write if include digits, which if you remember returns true or false. We'll want to loop over each item in the digits array and push it to the possible password chars array. So in the for each method, we'll just say for each digit, possible password chars.push digit. Since include digits is currently checked, we should see the value of possible password chars containing our digits. I'll console.log possible password chars and check the console. Great, it looks like our array holds the digits. So if we turn off the include digits toggle, it should be removed from the array because when the function is called, we initialize an empty array for possible password chars, and then add the items in as needed. So unchecking the checkbox for included digits, we are now returned with an empty array for possible password chars. Perfect. I'll go ahead and write a comment above the array initialization so that we can know that it's reset every time the function is called. I'll also go ahead and add some helpful comments to each of the conditionals so that we know exactly what's going on and what they're there for. So now let's repeat that process for special char. I'll set up a conditional for our special char, and if that input is checked, we'll run the for each method on our specials array and push each special character into our possible password chars array. Then I'll do the same for letter mix, but this one will be slightly different since we're going to be working with two separate arrays. One for uppercase letters and one for lowercase letters. We will always have lowercase letters in the generated password, so we'll need to write this condition accordingly. First, we'll check if letter mix is true, and if it is, we'll loop over the letters lowercase array and push each letter into our possible password chars array. And then we'll do the same for uppercase letters. We'll loop over each letter in that array and also push it to the possible password chars array. This condition will have an else, so if it's not checked, we'll still push the lowercase letters into the possible password chars array, and this is so that even if everything is toggled off, we can still generate a password with just lowercase letters. So we'll basically just rewrite what's on line 30, where we loop over our lowercase letters and push each letter into the possible password chars array. Now, if we console.log possible password chars, each time we click a toggle switch, we should have an array with different possible characters for our password. And we see that it's working perfectly. So now we have all the possible characters our password can contain based off our user's settings. This is all the info we need to generate the password, so let's set that part up next. Since we have access to the length of our password when the function is called, thanks to our length argument, let's run a for loop. We can write for, and we'll set I to 0, and while I is less than or equal to length, we'll want to increment I by 1. Each time this loop runs, we want to insert a character into our generated password input field. We don't currently have this element set up in a variable, so let's set that up real quick. At the top of the file, I'll write generated password input equals document.getElementById generated password input. And now we can use this variable in the for loop. Back in the for loop, I'll write generated password input dot value plus equals. And what we'll want to do is grab a random value from our array of possible password characters. We can do that by writing our array name and using brackets to select a random index. To get a random index, we can write math.floor as a method, and inside the floor method, we can write math.random multiplied by the length of our array. If we hit save, you'll already notice a random password generated in the input, and this is because we call the function when the extension loads. Clicking on a toggle switch should update it as well, but we kind of see a bug. We are always adding to the input value, when we need to actually be re-rendering the input's value each time we change or update this password. And this is an easy fix. We need to reset the generated password each time the function is called, so all we'll need to do is just write generated password dot value equals an empty string toward the beginning of the function. Now each time we change a setting, the password is re-rendered and we have a perfectly generated password based off how the user wants it. Sweet. You'll also notice that we can update the slider to create a different length password. All that's left to do now is to add some functionality for the user to copy their password to the clipboard, and that's actually pretty simple. At the bottom of app.js, I'll just set up a variable, copy password button, and it'll equal document.getElementById copy password. And we'll also want to reference our confirmation container, so I'll just write confirmation equals document.getElementById confirmation. Let's set up a click event listener for our button, and all we'll need to do is just write copy password button dot add event listener, and we want to listen for clicks, and inside the callback function, all we'll want to do is write navigator.clipboard.write text, and write text is a method that takes in one parameter, and that's the text that you want to copy. So let's pass in our generated password input.value. Now, if we click the copy button, we can see that we're now able to paste in the password because it was copied to our clipboard. Pretty neat. Now let's tackle the confirmation. We'll just write confirmation.classlist.add active. Now, if we click the copy button, we get our confirmation popping up, but how do we get it to go away? Let's set up a set timeout, and in the callback, we'll just remove the active class, and we'll set the timeout to 2000 milliseconds, or 2 seconds. And now if we click copy, the message pops up, and then it goes away after 2 seconds. Great. Okay, so the part that you've all been waiting for, how exactly do we turn this into a Google Chrome extension? Well, it's extremely simple. In the root of your project, just create a manifest.json file. In here, you want to create an object, and this isn't just regular JavaScript, so syntax is important. Make sure your properties are all surrounded by quotation marks. You want to create a name property, and for the value, you can write the name of your extension. Since this is the first main version of our extension, set the version to 1.0, and you'll also want to set up a property called manifest_version, and set it to number 3. Set up a description for your extension. I'll just write a strong password generator. And now we want to set up a property for our icons, which holds an object. In this object, I'll give it a property called 16, and the value is a relative path to the 16 pixel icon. And then I'll do the same for the 48 pixel icon as well as the 128. Then I'll hop out of that icon's object, and then I'll write a property for action. This will also be an object, and it'll have a property called default_icon. And this will have a value that holds the path to my 16 pixel icon. Then it'll have another property called default_popup, and this holds the relative path for our popup.html file. And believe it or not, that's it. That's all we need to create this extension. Again, you don't need the icons to get this to work, but if you have them already, this is how you can use them. Next, in Google Chrome, navigate to your extensions manager and make sure in the top right you have developer mode turned on. Then you should see an option in the top left called Load Unpacked. Click this and then select the project folder for your extension and click Select. And there you go, your extension is now in Google Chrome. You can see your unpacked extensions by this red icon in the bottom right of your extension. If you click on your extensions in the top right of your browser, you'll see your extension listed, and you can even pin it. And when you click on it, you'll have your fully working extension in your Google Chrome browser that you can use anytime you want. If you need to make changes to your extension, you can work locally in the popup.html file, or you can make changes in the code and then press the refresh button in the extensions manager to reload it. And you'll see all your changes live. All right, we're done. Not only did we create a strong password generator, but we turned it into a Google Chrome extension. And as you saw, converting our project into an extension was not very hard to do at all. So I hope I start seeing some really awesome extensions in the future. Remember, please check out the teacher's notes or description down below for articles on secure password managers that you could use instead of this. Again, this was just for learning purposes. I'll see you all in the next one, and until then, have fun and happy coding.